I'm so pleased to be here. I've never been in Ballinasloe, and can you hear me? You cannot. Can you hear me now? Okay. Some of you may be here because you think I have traced the artist J.J. Beegan back to an individual who once lived here in Ballinasloe. And I want to make absolutely clear at the start that I have not managed to trace him. This talk is about searching for a person called J.J. Beegan and failing to find him, and needing to recalibrate and rethink what I was looking for and how I was undertaking my research, even what kind of a historian I was trying to be. It's about the kinds of questions that open up or may open up when your research goes wrong and you have to ask different kinds of questions. So I first saw the film you've just watched on an NHS computer screen in David O'Flynn's office in the psychiatric hospital in Lambeth that you saw also in the film, where he was working as a consultant. I'm very glad David is here because he knows way more about all of this than I do, and he can contribute, I hope, in questions. I'd made contact with him after I came across the images by the man known as J.J. Beegan at the exhibition in Paris you've just been hearing about. I happened to wander in off the street. I just happened to be in Paris for a weekend in September 2018. And I was going, I wandered in. And as I describe it in an essay I wrote about this experience, I was initially really disturbed by many of the images that I saw on the walls, and searching for something I could kind of bear to look at, I came across these small drawings by Beegan. I'm going to call him that for now. And then I read in the catalogue that he'd been a patient at Netherne Hospital in Coulsdon. And I was kind of taken aback because Netherne was where my mother worked and where my grandparents worked before that. And in fact, it was where my father was born in 1929 and where I spent a great deal of time when I was small. This is the point at which I probably need to explain that my mother is from a small townland, Affadown, between Skibbereen and Ballinasloe. She was born in 1930, and along with practically everybody else, she left her small farm in 1948 in order to train to be a nurse at Netherne. Her older sister had gone in 1946. And many of those Irish nurses stayed for a bit and then moved on. But my mother happened to meet my father, who was sort of born there, literally born in the hospital, because his parents had moved from Wales in the previous generation. They'd come up in the 1920s, because these big hospitals were staffed always by people from elsewhere. So my mother actually stayed around, and after she had got the four of us off to school, she went back to work in Netherne. And Netherne was where I spent my school holidays, walking up and down those corridors and going to, pantomimes in the hall that you saw. So it was weird finding these images and knowing really a lot about the atmosphere and the place where they had been made. I obviously don't need to explain to you, if there are people from Ballinasloe here, what it is like growing up next to a very large mental hospital or psychiatric institution, and the way in which everyday life gets entwined with that institution. The work of Una Walsh on Ballinasloe Hospital has been very important in me thinking through these ideas. She's written a lot about the hospital in the 19th century, built, as we know, in 1833, the Dangerous Lunatics Act that was passed in 1838 meant that people from prisons and hospitals were moved into the hospital. Prisons and workhouse hospitals were moved into the psychiatric institution, often when they shouldn't have been there. And one of the things that Una Walsh talks about, and this is relevant for something I'm going to come to later, is that because it was possible for anyone to commit an individual under the Dangerous Lunatics Act, one of the arguments Una Walsh makes is that the hospital ended up being used as a resource by families who might have a tricky relative or a senile relative, or might be very low on funds. And so the hospital ended up being kind of used as a resource for family members. There's an important book, I think, by a sociologist of psychiatry called Irving Goffman, whose work Asylums, which was published in 1961. It was based on his field work in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington State, a huge hospital with over 7,000 patients. One of the things that Goffman says in Asylums is that this is a quotation, mental patients suffer distinctively from contingencies. He means by that there are many people just as ill or disturbed or ill at ease, not in a hospital as in a hospital, but the people who end up in hospital are there because of contingencies such as how far from the hospital they live, whether their family has sufficient means to find an alternative to putting them in the hospital, and things like that. And again, this is something I want us to bear in mind when we're thinking about Beegan. What were the contingencies that meant that the person known as J.J. Beegan lived in Netherne Hospital in the south of England in the 1940s? You've heard that the catalogue of the exhibition in Paris quoted an account by the art therapist Edward Adamson of how he encountered Beegan. He says these drawings, and he's talking about the drawings that we've seen on the toilet paper. The toilet paper, again, older people in the room, it's Izal medicated toilet paper. You remember that stuff, really scratchy, horrible blue paper. And that's why it doesn't kind of dissolve too easily when he scratches away at it with his charcoal. These drawings were presented to me by a very ill man. Adamson, soon after he arrived at the hospital, ends up doing a tour, basically. He's been asked to set up art therapy, and he has to get a sense of the hospital. So he says, soon after he arrived, he visited the locked back wards of the hospital. Having passed through long corridors and many locked and relocked doors, I was ushered into a large hall containing about 100 people. Many of the inhabitants underwent brain operations, and consequently many were shaven-headed. Others were swathed in bandages and were disfigured by post-operative bruises and black eyes. By the time he met Beegan, Adamson explained, Beegan, quote, had been in this locked ward in the hospital for many years. He was incontinent and unable to speak clearly. He drew vigorously on the only paper he could find. As we've heard, Adamson brought Beegan into his studio and he gave him an easel, large sheets of paper, and materials to work with. Beegan took to filling the paper with drawings of men and animals and writing out abstruse, disconnected thoughts. I should be showing you some of these images, and I'd forgotten I even had them with me. There's the Izal medicated toilet paper. These are images you've seen before. This is the works of Robert Louis Stevenson and a drawing done with the nurse's blue pencil. This is another one from the flyleaf. This is one of my favorites. Look at that nose. It's just fabulous. Adamson explains, this man lived in a world of his own. He did many similar drawings, covered with esoteric writing, which obviously had a private meaning for him. I actually don't have any of the images that are full of his small bits of writing. I just didn't have the right, I didn't have them. There is no record of the illness that affected him or of the treatments he received. We know only that he was kept in the locked ward with other bruised and battered men for many years. It is likely, as David O'Flynn says in the film, that he had had his teeth removed and possibly other organs too, following the sepsis theory of mental illness that was popular in the 1920s, and that he underwent brain surgery or insulin coma therapy or electroconvulsive therapy, or all three. He may have had seizures induced by injections of cardiazol. How do we say that? Is that right, David? All these therapies were common in the hospital through the 1930s and 40s for illnesses as diverse as schizophrenia and epilepsy. So some of the images are full of esoteric writing, but some of the writing is extremely clear. There are two similar drawings done with charred matchsticks on toilet paper, which he must have executed in the locked ward before he met Adamson, because they're done on the loo paper, not the big sheets. One is of something like a medicine bottle. I've just extracted that and turned it from its side. Something like a medicine bottle with a label that reads, J.J. Beegan, Sculptor, Dunlore Street, Ballinasloe. The other is of one of his characteristic flattened faces in profile, sitting on top of a triangular body, like a cone, drawn in such a way as to suggest, I think, 3 dimensions. Both the bottle and the triangular cone feature the same stand underneath them here. And it's this, I think, that helps give them their 3-dimensional appearance and marks them out as works of art, as though they are drawings of standalone sculptures. Underneath the man cone here, he has written, J.J. Beegan, Sculptor, Dunlop Hill, Ballinasloe. When I watched the film on David's computer in the hospital in Lambeth that day, I was bothered, as I am sure you were bothered, by the mispronunciation of Ballinasloe, unless secretly you do all call it Ballinasloe here, which I doubt. I was bothered about it, and it struck me that there was something very odd about the fact that Beegan seemed to have been writing down his name and address, yet, despite all the interest in the drawings and, taking them to Paris to be exhibited, no one had bothered to look him up. So when I got home that evening, I searched online for Dunlop Hill in Ballinasloe. Dunlop Hill is a hill in Dunlop, East Ayrshire, Google told me. But it also asked, did you mean Dunloe Hill, Ballinasloe? And I did, of course, or rather, J.J. Beegan did. When I turned to the Irish census records, I could quite easily find John Beegan, who was born in 1868, the eldest child of John and Jane Beegan. In 1901, they were living together with the younger Beegans, Mary and Thomas, at 23 Dunloe Hill in Ballinasloe. On the census form, John Beegan Sr. describes himself and his two sons as stonecutters. 10 years later, in the 1911 census, I'm doing all this on my laptop at home. You know, it's very easy to look up this material. He chose the term monumental stonemason instead of stonecutter. The family were skilled craftsmen who worked primarily cutting and carving gravestones. They did high-class, ornate work and had a very good reputation. Some of the early 20th century memorials at Kilbegley Graveyard in Roscommon are signed by the Beegan stonemasons. I also could find that out from my laptop. Of course, many people in this room know this because you live here and you've seen Beegan memorials. You may not know that there's a large Celtic cross carved by the Beegans as a memorial to the 4th Earl of Clancarty, erected over his grave at Highgate Cemetery in London, just up the road from where I live. By the time of the 1911 census, John Beegan's eldest son, John Leo Beegan, was married and living in another, slightly grander house in Dunloe Hill, a double-fronted townhouse with its own stables, a piggery, a hen house, and other outbuildings. He lists his profession as sculptor. I could discover from the births, marriages, and deaths registry that he had married Mary Ann Byrne 2 years earlier, and that they now had a baby son, also called John. Mary Ann was the eldest daughter of the local butcher, who was the Beegan's neighbour on Dunloe Hill. Beegan, I think, married up. The Byrne family could afford to have 3 servants living with them in 1911. Their wedding was held in Rathmines. So either they had quite a bit of money and connections, or at least one set of parents disapproved of the marriage and they eloped to return home with the marriage accomplished. Now, I could keep going. I spent months inside the world of the Beegans of Ballinasloe. I could tell you about the struggle in the late 19th century between skilled artisans and local farmers in Ballinasloe, about the land the Beegans rented in the quarry for their stone, about the huge stone, and amazingly, I've got a picture of this, courtesy of Damien McAnula, this huge stone here that lay outside their house on Dunloe Hill for years, waiting for the funds to put it up for the memorial at Ochrim. Again, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, am I? Ochrim? You'll tell me later. I could tell you about John Leo's debts, his run-ins with the owner of the local newspaper, William Hastings. All this and loads more can be found out from census returns, court records, newspaper archives. And here I want to give a shout out to several local historians who were amazingly generous with their time and expertise, helping me track down bits of information, including Eamon Healy, Brian Casey, and Damien McAnula, who gave me this image, which is a drawing made by his primary school teacher, Declan Burke, of the stone on the hill in Dunloe Hill. It was incredibly important for me to encounter people like Damien and Brian Casey, partly because they helped me find things out, but also because they acted as a kind of sounding board. I was able to say, you know, as I was fiddling about in the records, does this sound right? Is this plausible? And it was quite important to have someone who would say, well, no, it's not quite plausible, because despite the fact that I seemed to have lit on something important when I discovered the link between J.J. Beegan, sculptor, and the Beegans of Dunloe Hill, who, after all, listed themselves in the census as stonemasons and sculptors, I wasn't getting anywhere. I couldn't find out who this person in Netherne Hospital was. I knew that he wasn't any of the obvious John Beegans of Dunloe Hill, the ones that I could find in the census, because they had all died at home in Ballinasloe, not in an English mental hospital. For a while, I became fixated on a missing death registration. John Leo Beegan died of pneumonia in February 1922, when he was in his early 50s, but his death wasn't registered until 1935, when the Widows' Pensions Act came in. And I wondered whether maybe John Leo had absconded, and that nothing was done about this. There was no death record, and maybe he'd just kind of done a flit. But when the widow's pension came in, his widow, or the woman who had been deserted, thought, aha, we need to do the registration now. And I was quite convinced by my theory. I had a theory about drink and delirium, which got him committed to Netherne Hospital and a long incarceration, until Damien discovered a newspaper report in the Connaught Tribune of John Leo's funeral in February 1922. So whoever J.J. Beegan was, it wasn't him. But I really wanted to find him. If we were to give Beegan back his place among human beings, and those of you who couldn't quite see the translation of the French there, the wonderful French, I can't think of the word, curator is the word I'm looking for, Martine Lusardi, is saying, we want to give him back his place among human beings. And I thought, if we really want to do that, we have to try and work out who he was, where he came from. But this is not a story about the value of persistence and hard work. I didn't find J.J. Beegan. All I found were a number of leads that didn't quite take me where I wanted to go. The closest I think I've come to is a record of a birth in Ballinasloe Workhouse in 1915 of a child called John Beegan. His mother, Annie, was unmarried. She seems to have returned home at some point to a farm near Ballinasloe, where she lived until she died, still single, in the 1960s. But what happened to her child? I could find no record of his death in Ireland. But that may be because he died young. The deaths of children who died in infancy, particularly if illegitimate and born in the workhouse, were often not recorded. But if this child survived, was he taken in by his relatives, the Beegans of Dunloe Hill? Did he work for them? Did he set out on his own as a teenager or young man, and did he end up out of work in London? I imagined him as a young man in England, a West of Ireland accent, little preparation for city life. At some point, he was picked up by the police and locked away. Was he homeless? Was he violent? At this point, there was very little difference between my attempts to find out more about J.J. Beegan and storytelling. Nethern's case histories are closed. They're all hospital case histories are closed for 100 years. So I cannot find out when J.J. Beegan entered the hospital or why. But a friend, in fact, Brendan McSivner, who's a historian in Galway, suggested I tried the 1939 register, a register of the wartime population of Britain. It was done to work out what the manpower would be in the war, that included hospitals and prisons. He said, at least that would give you a birth date, or hopefully it would give you a birth date. And the register, again, is really easy to access online. Just type it in, up it comes. There are nearly 1,000 names on the list compiled at Netherne. Each patient is listed by surname, forename, date of birth, and sex. The list is organised by ward, and you've seen those pictures of the hospital, it was vast. The list is not organised alphabetically, in other words, so it took a long time to check through. And what I discovered by this checking was that the name Beegan doesn't appear at all. This was at least confirmation of something that I suspected but didn't want to acknowledge, that J.J. Beegan was probably someone else entirely, someone who knew Ballinasloe and knew the Beegans because he knew where they lived. Perhaps a labourer who'd worked for them for a while, cutting stone, or a neighbour, or someone who knew St. Michael's Church. This picture was sent to me by Brian Casey, a picture of the font in your church, St. Michael's Church. And I hope you can see that the bottom, the stand bit says, presented by John and Jane Beegan. And it made me wonder whether that's where the JJ comes from. You know, as a child, you're quite small, you're kind of stand height, and you're seeing John and Jane Beegan. Anyway, the lack of a Beegan in the 1939 register was a disappointing discovery, mainly because it meant that there's very little chance of ever working out who the artist known as J.J. Beegan really was. And I have a feeling you may all be thinking, yeah, definitely, I've come out on a cold Friday afternoon to hear you say that you don't know anything. I hear you, and I apologise. But as I suggested at the beginning of my talk, I think these wrong turns are valuable. And at this point, I want to turn to thinking about what that wrong turn, why it might be helpful. I find myself frustrated by the kind of outsider art interpretation of art and storytelling produced by people in long-term incarceration. It's very often a kind of assumption that what we're finding in this art is kind of resilience, spirit, creativity under duress, all of which is true, of course, but I don't think it's true enough. I also think there is a tendency for there to be something voyeuristic about it. You know, this person is trapped, and now we can see the art that they've produced out of this entrapped environment. So what I had set out in my search for when I set out in my search for who Beegan really was, I thought I was going to put the man back at the heart of his work. And I was kind of worried about an almost, I think, primitivist or exotic celebration of artwork produced in difficult circumstances. And I thought I could unpick it by saying, no, here's the real person. This was his background. I could give a biography of this artist. But I couldn't. And that sent me back to what I did know about him. And I think what we know about J.J. Beegan is that he was a man who remembered. He remembered life before he was incarcerated in the hospital. I've no idea who he was, but I know he remembered things. He maybe remembered that font. He remembered fish and birds and images from his past. There isn't a single image, apart from possibly the medicine bottle, that actually shows him looking at something in front of him. What he's doing is trying to keep a hold on something that he knew before. What J.J. Beegan's art helps us to understand is what happens when people can no longer understand their experience in terms of a life story, something with a beginning and a middle that unfolds, in which one thing leads to another, a story that has a shape that leads towards a future. I just remembering one of the statements in the film from a patient saying, life in the hospital was as though you knew you weren't going to live for very long. You couldn't think about a future. There wasn't a possible narrative leading towards something different from today. The question I should have been asking about those images is, what is the function of artistic expression, painting and storytelling, when the possibility of a developing life is taken away from you? We narrate our lives according to a timeline of events succeeding each other in time. When you're cut off from your family, when you're cut off from the process of generations succeeding one another, what is it that you hold on to? These questions are important because they also govern how we can think about life stories for the many people who are not incarcerated. It also affects our ideas of life stories for people who are on the other side of the boundaries of the institutions, who are able to come and go freely. And here, I'm thinking about my own relatives. When I think about J.J. Beegan, I also have to consider that my grandfather and my grandmother may have been the people who turned the key on him. It is very possible that my Auntie Mary, who had left Lachine in 1946, helped move him from the locked ward to Adamson's studio. I know this because my mother, who arrived in 1948, remembers guiding patients from wards to the studio. So this is one of their tasks. What I'm trying to get to here is that J.J. Beegan is leading me back to think about all our roles in the kind of institutionalization of people's lives. I've done quite a lot of work on things like mother and baby homes and other Irish institutions of incarceration. And one of the statements that I have made in print is that Irish society was, during the early 20th century, probably one of the most institutionalized societies in the world. This is a statement that has been taken up and repeated, and I'm obviously very glad that it has, because I think it is true. But I think it's important, and I want to just slightly come away from Beegan for a moment, important to consider what exactly we mean when we say that and what its implications are. So, the claim that Irish society was one of, if not the most institutionalized societies in the world in the 20th century, is one that I have worked through in long conversations with a historian in Galway called Nicholas Canny. Many of you may know him. When I realized I was going to be talking about this here, I rang him up and I said, Nicholas, have you put this anywhere in print? Or is it only me who's got it in print? Because I think it's really important that we kind of are clear about where ideas come from. And he said he thought he hadn't put it in print. What does it mean? If there are more people living in institutions, there are less people living in families. I don't think it means that Ireland simply locked more people up. So I want to spend a moment thinking about that. The institutionalisation of Irish life is probably more true of rural Ireland than the country as a whole. Most children in Dublin and the larger urban centres remained home, staying at home until well into their teens. But at the other extreme, in rural Ireland and in smaller county towns, there were very few teenagers about, other than sons and occasionally daughters who were destined to inherit family businesses, farms and shops. The remainder had either emigrated at or before age 16 or were in some kind of institution. For the better off, there were girls' boarding schools, for example, in almost every town of any size. These convent schools also usually took day pupils from the towns, and many of the convents also ran orphanages, using different nuns to manage the business there. More boys from rural areas emigrated at a young age, which meant that there were fewer boys' boarding schools. My goodness, we've got the power back. Junior seminaries were run by diocesan priests. These drew heavily on rural communities and small towns. People born into urban communities had a better chance of remaining at home for longer. On the other hand, there were probably more from working-class urban areas in reformatory schools than in rural areas. I would think that is certainly true of boys. There may have been more young women from rural areas in mother and baby homes. I'm not sure. Then we think about the seminaries. Maynooth and other secular seminaries drew from rural areas and small towns at the end of secondary school. Religious orders drew more from towns and cities, and some recruited at a very early age. The Christian Brothers drew recruits from cities, small towns, and rural areas in that order, and they recruited towards the end of primary school. You know, people are moving into these institutions at the age of 11. You'll see from this impressionistic appraisal that it's very difficult to generalize. There was a grave suspicion, I think, in rural areas and small towns of having young people about unless there was a clear career path marked out for them. And thirdly, Ireland, especially rural Ireland, surrendered an extraordinary number of young people to nunneries, seminaries, and boarding institutions where they were closed off from the outside world from the age of 12 to 18. Then there were the psychiatric institutions and county homes, mother and baby homes, and laundries. We're talking about a huge number of young people who had to reorientate their view of an individual life story as part of an institution, whether as victims or beneficiaries. And I think there's often a very fine line between being a victim or a beneficiary of those institutions. I don't have time to do more here than gesture towards the impact of this very particular social history on how we might rethink the way we think about these institutions. I'm not, of course, suggesting that Irish society is still institutionalized in that manner. There's been a wholesale rejection of the institutions that were so powerful in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But I do think that perhaps the legacy persists. And I just want to come to the work. Now you're going to help me pronounce this name.
The moment's arrived. Vukashin Neblajek.
Vukashin Neblajek, whose work, Asylum Archive, I really recommend that you look at. It's easily accessible online. It's a kind of art project looking at the practice and the physical experience of direct provision and emergency accommodation for refugees and asylum seekers. And, I bring it in here because that very word, asylum, it is the same. And one of the things that Vukashin is thinking about in this project is the boundary between the inside and the outside of the institution. He's very interested in the walls. surrounding walls and the state of buildings. And many of the, well, not many, but several of the buildings that he looks at that are used currently for direct provision were previously mother and baby homes and other institutions from the 1950s and 60s. I think, again, this is work that asks us to think about who is allowed a life story in which one thing leads to another and who is not. It asks us to think about how people who may be kept in were also socially cast out. And I just want to end by pointing out that I am definitely not suggesting that this is a uniquely Irish problem. My last example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about is an art project that touches on the life of a young man called Shani Lewis, who died aged 23 after prolonged restraint by police inside Bethlehem Royal Hospital in 2010. He had voluntarily admitted himself to the hospital, voluntarily gone there because he felt that he was about to undergo an episode of ill health, and he was killed, I think, the same day. It was the same day. And this is an artwork that you saw earlier in the film, that the Bethlehem Royal Hospital was housing artwork from the Adamson collection, and it has an art gallery on site. And one of the artworks in 2020 was this set of placards by Mark Titchener, which were a series of questions set at that boundary wall. I think this boundary wall is very interesting and important. Series of questions looking out from the hospital to the passers-by. Questions like, where have you been? Where are you going? What are you doing? Just questions asking us to think about who we are and what our life story is. And David may want to talk about this, but at a certain point, this artwork was covered in graffiti, red paint graffiti, which read, R.I.P. Shani. It's an artwork that created a new artwork commemorating somebody who had been subject to the violence of the institution. So I'm going to end now. What did my search for J.J. Beegan help me find? I think it helped me think about the consequences of incarceration for the refugee, for those who are mentally ill, for the poor. Help me think about how their life stories, broken and curtailed as they may be, how their life stories might be told, and also, therefore, how our life stories on the other side of that institutional boundary are also affected by that boundary wall. Thank you very much.